audience. So hello. Oop, continue recording. Okay, great. So my name is Rietta Hohman. So I am the Kelp Recovery Program Coordinator for the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary in partnership with the Greater Farallones Association. So today I'm going to talk about kelp recovery efforts in the sanctuary and some steps that we have taken to address severe kelp loss on the North Coast. And this is the outline. Oh, let's go next. There we go. Okay. So this is just the broad overview of what I'm going to talk about today. So first of all, I'm going to touch on the National Marine Sanctuary Network, including the overall network, and then we're going to dial down to the West Coast of North America, and specifically in the sanctuaries that are in California. And that really is just to give some spatial awareness to where sanctuaries are located and some of the things that we do, and sort of orient everyone around kind of why I'm talking about kelp forests today. And how it's important for the Greater Farallones specifically. So I'm going to touch on the loss of kelp forests on the North Coast. I'm not really going to dig into this too much because I think at this point, a lot of folks are familiar with the extent and scale and contributing factors to kelp loss, but I will touch on them. But if you feel like I go over that, too briefly, please do reach out with questions and I'm happy to address them. I'm going to also dig into our kelp recovery plan that we developed with a really amazing collaborative of folks that we brought together a couple of years ago to address severe kelp loss. And then we're going to dig in a bit into restoration and recovery and specific actions that we're taking in the sanctuary. And that includes West Coast sanctuaries, because we have this really amazing team of West Coast sanctuaries I'm going to talk about, but specifically within Greater Farallones. And I'm going to do a broad overview of several different projects, and you can feel free to reach out to me with questions for specifics about those projects. And then, of course, we're going to talk about what is next for our program and for the sanctuary. So I put this in here because I always forget to introduce myself. As a avid diver for over, oh gosh, how long have I been a diver? For almost 15 years. I got into scientific diving in 2011. And I have been a diver since then. So for the past decade, I've been doing a lot of research diving. Now, I was in a pretty bad accident a couple of years ago, so I wasn't able to dive for a while, which was a massive bummer, but I'm getting back into it. Super stoked to actually conduct some projects for a kelp program that are going to be underwater. So super stoked about all of that. I established the kelp recovery program with support from our association and from the sanctuary in 2016 and 2017. Now, severe loss of kelp happened really in a dramatic shift between 2013 and 2014. And I was a diver on the North Coast at that time, and it was devastating to go to sites that I had been helping monitor for several years and really just see a massive, massive loss of kelp forest habitat. And so it really struck me after a couple of years that nothing was being done about it. And so in 2016, I really made a big decision to go back to school and pursued my master's degree in environmental management, specifically to address management actions for kelp forest loss on the North Coast. And I ended up really studying the influence of climate change on kelp forest loss and actual restoration actions that can be taken to recover kelp forests. So that's just a quick snippet of my background and why we're talking today. So the National Marine Sanctuary Network is actually all around the United States as well as American Samoa. And so we have 15 national marine sanctuaries that help protect specifically areas of ecological significance and areas of maritime heritage. So they're really designated places where we want to help protect that piece of the ocean. And a lot of what we do as a National Marine Sanctuary is help protect wildlife, including birds and marine mammals, and conduct surveys of them each year, preventing wildlife disturbance from things like boats and planes. and really helping protect those habitats. And we also, prevent like oil drilling and things like that. So this is just giving an overview of those 15 national marine sanctuaries, as well as a couple of national monuments and a proposed national marine sanctuary. So if we dig down into the North Coast, this is the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary borders. So just to give you an idea of the area that it encompasses. So just outside of the Golden Gate Bridge, the sanctuary extends past the Farallone Islands and all the way up the coastline to Point Arena / Manchester, if you've ever been up on the North Coast. So this is the area that we help protect and manage as a sanctuary. Okay, so just touching on kelp forest loss. This is depicting a graphic here on the left with the kelp canopy cover from aerial plane-based surveys that the state used to run. And then on the right, you can see those are where those locations are in relation to the sanctuary, sorry. And so you can see at each of these sites, 2008 was actually a really good year for kelp relative. But we can see once 2014 rolls around, there was this massive loss of kelp forest habitat, which persisted through 2015 and 2016. And so, a pretty significant concern for extended kelp forest loss, especially with bull kelp, is that it's an annual species. And so it does need to reestablish on an annual basis to be able to persist in that area. And so there is a fairly large concern for the reestablishment of bull kelp after extended loss. So this is just a quick snippet of some economic impacts. So the loss of kelp forest habitat really led to these extended impacts on nearshore fisheries, including the recreational red abalone fishery, which had a estimated value, non-market value of about $44 million for coastal communities. And then the commercial red sea urchin fishery in the region, so not for California, but in Northern California, collapsed. And that was estimated to be about a $3 million fishery. So you can see here, this is at Ocean Cove with these really great pictures taken by CDFW. So you can see Ocean Cove here on the left in 2012 looks really healthy, lots of canopy. But in 2016, at about the same location, we see there's really nothing. And then if you go underwater, you're going to see urchins, lots and lots and lots of urchins, and very little remaining kelp. So this is actually a really amazing but complex infographic from Rogers Bennett and Catton. And this is resulting from their survey cruises that they've done for many years, for over 20 years on the North Coast. And so the reason they're all aligned here is showing this trigger or a threshold event where all of these are really correlated. And so I know there's a lot here, but just to take a snapshot of all of them, you can see up here at the top, is showing sea surface temperature increasing on average up here. So I think folks are familiar with the North Pacific blob, or the marine heat wave that lasted for over 700 days back in 2014, 2015. And so where that becomes an issue is that warmer temperatures, basically above 12 degrees, don't really hold nutrients very well anymore. And nutrients are pretty critical for kelp. And so with warmer temperatures, kelp isn't really able to absorb as many nutrients or grow as well. It also has trouble in its little beginning stages to be able to establish and grow. So there's a lot of challenges with extended durations of warm sea surface temperatures. So this is just showing past. You can see down here, there's the timeline that goes from 2003 to 2018, and that applies to all of these graphics here. So 2014 really is the trigger here, right? So you can see those sea surface temperatures warmer than usual. And here we see our Pycnopodia, our sunflower star, decreasing, and that was due to the sea star wasting syndrome. So it affected over 20 species of sea stars. but sunflower stars in particular. And so they are now critically endangered. And so there are some programs that are looking into how to culture them and reintroduce them in the wild. So we'll see how that goes, but they are a very important predator for urchins. And so we can see their population declining pretty dramatically after 2014. And then, of course, our little purple urchins increased in density, greater than 60 times their historic average on the North Coast. So we see there's a really dramatic rise there. And then red abalone populations also decreased quite dramatically after 2014. So I'll move on from this one. Okay, so I mentioned, a couple of years had gone by since extensive kelp loss. Nothing was really being done. And so we really wanted to do something. And so the sanctuary actually expanded in 2015. It nearly doubled in size. And the habitat that it now covered had a significant amount of kelp forest habitat, or areas where kelp forest used to be. But prior to 2015, it didn't really have that much kelp forest habitat in it. So that's just a little information, like historical tidbit. So when 2016 rolled around, I, with the really amazing support of the sanctuary and the association, established this little tiny kelp program, which I worked on for about 4 to 8 hours a week to really start to investigate what could be done to address kelp loss. And then in 2017 and 2018, we pulled together a really amazing group. I'm going to come back to this slide in a second, but we pulled together this amazing group of people who either represented a group that had vested interests in kelp forests, or who had some element of research or monitoring programs or scientific expertise who could contribute to the conversation, and brought them all to the table and investigated what was the extent of kelp forest loss, what known data sets were there, and how should we be evaluating them to take the next most appropriate action steps. And so that working group really took place over about 8 months. And coming out of that group was this Sonoma-Mendocino bull kelp recovery plan, which contained recommendations and strategies primarily for management agencies, including the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. So we determined some specific things that each management agency should take, but also what they should be doing together as a collaborative between state and federal agencies. And so we also wanted this to take a broad overview of everything. So we included strategies for kelp restoration on the ground, monitoring efforts, research, and community engagement, and how we could reach out to coastal communities and continue to work with them and make sure that we're aligned with messaging and making sure everyone is informed and on the same ground. So I'm going to talk about some specific actions coming out of that plan that we've been working to implement. And this was the first comprehensive kelp restoration plan for kelp forests in California. So the key recommendations in that plan included, as I mentioned, we really wanted to have this broad focus and from these different approaches. And so for monitoring and research, the primary recommendation was developing a cost-effective, sustainable monitoring program. So we really identified that there was a critical information gap. The North Coast is a challenging environment to get out and underwater. And the state aerial surveys that used to be conducted were ceased due to funding issues and logistical problems, and a lot of just kind of mostly funding it boiled down to. So that left a really critical information gap that we identified we really needed to address. And so the plan recommends utilizing remote sensing and drones to be able to monitor kelp forests on the North Coast. And it identifies a series of sites to focus efforts. And I'll talk a little more about that in a moment. There also is a site selection process for restoration. So the working group actually did this part. So the plan included recommendations for it, but the working group implemented this partially, which was compiling all of these data sets in a spatially explicit way for application to a site selection decision tree. And so if you take a look at the plan, it actually does work through that decision tree, at least the first steps of it based on what we knew at the time. So we took basically data sets from aerial plane-based surveys and locations of subtitle surveys, and then incorporated that with a whole bunch of different factors, including accessibility and freshwater outputs and boat launch areas and a bunch of different things. And really outlined what priority sites should efforts be focused on. And so there were 3 tiers that were built out with that. So that's how we have been approaching our efforts, is with that process where they really identified the key areas to be focused on. And I think the most important piece was that aerial data, looking at historical cover or pre-2014, and then what we defined as current persistence or past 2014, or 2014 to 2016 was the data we had at the time, and seeing where those overlapped and where we should be focusing efforts. And then lastly, we get to community engagement. So this is last, but it is definitely not least. This is a huge part of what we're trying to implement with our program. And so we want to look at consistent messaging and develop a comprehensive outreach plan that increases participation and awareness, and reaching out to different groups that have any sort of interest or investment in kelp forests and coastal areas, that we can get engaged and contribute to the conversation. And so I'm going to talk about kind of how we approached each one of these here in just a moment. And do feel free to stop me if anyone has any questions at any time. You can feel free to jump in and let me know your questions. Okay, so I'm going to have a bit of text here, the next 2 slides, but then I'm going to share some really cool photos and our ongoing projects. So bear with me for the next 2 slides. Okay, so one of the first things we identified is that we really want to engage with our West Coast region, right? So along the West Coast, there are 4 national marine sanctuaries that have kelp forests within their borders. And that includes Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary, Greater Farallones, Monterey Bay, and Channel Islands. So we pulled together representatives from each of these sanctuaries, with Greater Farallones as the lead, and formed a team where we can each discuss with our relative areas the management concerns involved with kelp forests, what research we need, what partnerships have been established, and how we should really move forward with communicating across the region, and what priorities should be developed for kelp forests conservation and restoration specifically. So it's a really amazing team, and we meet a few times a year, and we've been working on some really great projects that I'm going to share. One of those projects is developing recommendations for each of those sanctuaries along the region for mapping and monitoring kelp forests. So that's a big piece of what we're doing right now. Developing and supporting kelp restoration and conservation initiatives with a specific focus on applications for sanctuaries. Seeking opportunities for restoration of kelp forests in the Greater Farallones. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but folks are welcome to ask me questions, but I'm just gonna cover it here in just a moment. So we want to, oh, it's out of order there. So we also are working on mapping priority kelp recovery sites identified in the kelp recovery plan in a really amazing collaboration with the Nature Conservancy and academic partners. Oh, it's so funny that one went first. We're also conducting some research cruises in the near future to look at kelp ecosystem surveys and really conduct a comprehensive restoration site assessment. So there's a lot of monitoring that happens in the sanctuary, but not with a restoration focus. So we really want to get out to these priority sites and assess what they look like underwater, focusing on what specific restoration techniques we can approach them with. So looking at densities of fish and algae and urchins, mapping out benthic characteristics, mapping kelp cover at these sites. And then we also are planning a outplanting project with Moss Landing Marine Labs as well for those research days. Then, of course, developing and supporting outreach and coastal community engagements. And then community-based science is an area that we're really hoping to develop pretty robustly in the future. So I'm excited to talk about that here in a minute. And so our West Coast Kelp team, this is just a pretty broad overview of some of the things that we're working on, including a gap analysis. So looking at both underwater and aerial surveys for remote sensing, for drones, and then subtidal scuba-based surveys, kind of anything that involves monitoring of kelp forests. We've put together in a really great map that I'm going to share in a moment. And then we're going to look at what those key partnerships are and who we're working with that we really want to continue working with and help support in the future. So the gap analysis is really to evaluate those pieces and where there might be gaps in information that we could help address as a sanctuary network or as individual sanctuaries. One of the things that we're going to establish really soon is a kelp forest webpage, kind of like an info page that's going to outline the loss of kelp forests throughout the sanctuary network, so all along the West Coast, conservation of those kelp forests, and what actions are being taken and where. So it's really just a sort of a comprehensive look at all sanctuaries on the West Coast. Then those mapping and monitoring recommendations that I mentioned a moment ago. And then we're going to develop a story map, which I am so excited for that to come together in the very near future. So we've put together this great map. This is just a snapshot of it, but the map is live and online and you can take a look at it. I'm happy to share the link, but it's on sanctuarysimon.org. And that's sort of a sister page to our sanctuary network. So you're welcome to check this map out. But basically, it outlines or depicts kelp forest ecosystem monitoring efforts that we are aware of for aerial UAS and scuba-based surveys within and nearby West Coast sanctuaries. And so this is just a still shot of Greater Farallones. So you can see there's a whole bunch of different monitoring efforts here. And these little circles are showing you the subtidal monitoring efforts. And then the size of the circle is how many years they've been surveyed. And then there's CDFW subtidal surveys. And then the uncrewed aerial systems or UAS surveys as well that are in here. And then, of course, all of our subtitle survey folks are outlined here. So this is just showing them all overlaid. This is a bit confusing and jumbled, but if you really zoom in and look at individual areas, this is such a helpful tool for understanding what monitoring happens and where. So we're really excited to use this in our gap analysis. Because it allows a strong visual representation of the spatial and temporal scale of monitoring in sanctuaries. And it will help us identify potential information and data gaps. So this is just showing Channel Islands, which is closer to you guys, and some of those monitoring efforts that are happening in that area and what proximity they have to the sanctuary. So again, I'm happy to pull up that map and send out the link so folks can see it. I see a couple. Oh, awesome. Thank you for sharing the link. Perfect. So this is just a quick snapshot of those, of that map. So oops, I think I clicked off of it. It's not like letting me go. There we go. Okay. So this is the other big project that we're working on with our West Coast region Kelp team. And we identified that we really want to understand better what the various imaging platforms are available for sanctuaries to tap into, and how we can align or standardize protocols for mapping and monitoring as much as possible. Some things may not necessarily fall under a good way to standardize things, right? But we do want to identify how we can share that information and communicate across the region. So we're investigating these imaging platforms, and by imaging, I mean remote sensing platforms like Landsat and Sentinel-2 and Planet, and then also aerial plane-based surveys. Like, we know that plane-based surveys are critical for Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary, and that's their primary method. And then also for drones as well, and investigating what capabilities and resources there are for sanctuaries to utilize each of those platforms. So, and that's just the broad overview, and it's basically a report that we're hoping to submit to the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries once we put it together as a team. So, yeah, so I think I covered all that. So ongoing monitoring efforts, existing data and partnerships available for kelp forest management sanctuaries. We want to align communication across the region, identify pathways for sharing information, and then form recommendations for both site-specific actions and then collaboration across sanctuaries, and collaboration with our partners as well. Okay, so we identified that we really wanted to develop a cost-effective mapping and monitoring program, or to really look at how we can get out there and monitor these priority sites. And so in 2019, with our partners, there was a really awesome collaborative effort initiated to map these recovery sites using those uncrewed aerial systems or drones. So this was a really awesome effort in 2019 and 2020 with various partners between the Nature Conservancy, our program, and then several academic institutions, including UCLA, CSUMB, UCSB, and then UC Santa Cruz, as well as supported on our end by the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation. So getting out to map all of these sites was a really incredible effort. And hopefully that data would be available for folks to be able to see. We've been working on putting together a publication for folks to look through to see the extent of the area that was mapped, and just summarize the results from the last couple of years. So I don't know when that will be published, but we're super excited for it all to come together. And this is just a snapshot of those sites. Our plan does include sites that are up in Mendocino as well. This is just showing sanctuary sites. So I just wanted to share some photos, some quick photos from that mapping effort. This is our amazing pilot, Waz, out mapping with a Phantom 4 Pro at Fort Ross. So you can see all of our pilots have to be FAA certified, Part 107. So they're really certified to conduct commercial work that's required by our permits. And all pilots really have extensive knowledge and experience of operating UAS, which is amazing. And then you can see there's a photo here of what kelp canopy looks like from the drone. So this, when the drones map, they actually take pictures. They don't really do video, so they take hundreds, sometimes with the bigger sites, like thousands of photos, which are then stitched together to form 2D orthomosaics or georeferenced images. And so this mapping effort, this is just to give sort of a visual of what it looks like. And I think this was in 2019, so you can see there's really not much kelp out there. Okay, so that was just a quick overview of the mapping efforts. So I mentioned really we also want to get underwater and see what's happening out there and do a restoration site assessment. So we are hoping to be able to go out and approach our priority sites this fall. And this effort is also really highly collaborative, but we're going to do a few different things, including with this restoration site assessment, we're looking at monitoring, well, not monitoring, but doing a snapshot at each site of invertebrates, algae, and fish, and sort of characterize the site as a whole, and determine, what really, like, what we're seeing underwater and how it's correlated with what we're seeing above water. And then we're working on a outplanting experiment, or at least a outplanting project with Moss Landing Marine Labs. And so they were funded last year by by California Sea Grant, to grow bull kelp and investigate different growing, different methods of growing, but also different methods of outplanting. And so we partnered with them. And this fall, we're going to be taking the bull kelp that they've been growing and outplanting them at specific sites. We don't, as of yet, have any funding to support urchin population management, but that is something that we really want to pursue. And there are some very promising opportunities in the near future. So really, with one of the biggest challenges is that each of these sites is still really considered an urchin barren, right? So urchins are still very dense at each of these sites, both red and purple urchins at these sites. And so most kelp recovery efforts need to really deal with the urchins first. And we have identified that working with commercial urchin divers is one of the best ways that we can approach this, because they have the knowledge, the expertise, the equipment, and the know-how to get out on the coast in a lot of these really remote areas that are tough to access otherwise, and conduct large-scale restoration efforts in a concentrated amount of time. So we are seeking funding to help initiate those efforts in the sanctuary. And they have actually been working with commercial divers up north. So north of the sanctuary near Fort Bragg, there's 3 sites where they have been working on removing urchins and conducting removal efforts in partnership with Reef Check and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the Ocean Protection Council. So we're hoping to do something similar in the sanctuary. So at any rate, we're really excited to be able to get out and do quite a few different things that will be really valuable for understanding what's going on at these sites, and how best to approach them. All right, and then as I mentioned, we're really excited to expand our community-based science efforts. So working with youth groups and the public, and volunteers to be able to implement these kelp recovery efforts. And so one of those that we are moving forward with in the fall, because we were awarded funding, is working with a sister program here at the sanctuary called the Long-Term Monitoring and Experiential Training for Students, or LIMPETS program, which works with middle school and high school students. So we're working with several high schools in Sonoma and Mendocino, and teaching actually several in-classroom programs where we are going to be focusing on kelp forest ecology, but also the intertidal. And so we're going to be inviting a commercial fisherman into the classroom to share his experience with the commercial urchin fishery, and the ongoing restoration efforts up north, with youth, and then have a kelp ecology class as well. And then they're going to learn about real intertidal monitoring efforts. And then the best part is that we're actually going to take them out to a site, and they're going to do intertidal monitoring and collect data on urchins and on abalone. And then we're going to introduce them to the drone flights and drone mapping, as a way to better understand applications for technology in the field. So they're going to get a really awesome introduction to intertidal monitoring and kelp restoration efforts. So we're really excited about that, and we're hoping to launch that in August and September and October. So it's coming up quick. We also are really interested in working with our Beach Watch program, which has been around for a long time, and they conduct beach surveys. And we are really interested in what data they can collect on stranded kelp or beach wrack, and how we can help better understand the locations and just specific data about that beach rack and how it might be correlated with kelp patches that exist along the coastline. So we're hoping to really dig into that partnership soon for the sanctuary. And then for kelp canopy surveys, we would love to expand this as an opportunity for citizen-based or citizen science or community-based science in the near future. So I think COVID has made all of this pretty challenging, but we have identified that we would really love to expand these opportunities in the future as COVID restrictions allow. But it seems like things are opening up and that will be supported in the near future. So we're really excited at what we can implement in the coming months. Okay, so this is a part that I'm super excited to share. And I think that several folks here are a part of our Kelp Recovery Network, or Kelp Ecosystem Landscape Partnership for Research on Resilience, the much longer name, which is affectionately called Kelper. So our Kelp Recovery Network really started as a way to get on the ground efforts going. So it was originally initiated by CDFW, I think back in 2016 is when it was actually initiated. And it was a way to pull people together to start some community-based work for active on-the-ground things like urchin removals. It has since evolved a bit from that. And it is now primarily a way for us to connect and share information and to really see what's happening across the region, and for people to share their projects and information and get connected with what's happening in terms of restoration and research. It's a way for community members to get involved or just be informed of what's happening. And these meetings are open to everyone, but some folks are definitely that are interested in contributing more extensively can do things like talks or lead discussions. So we're really kind of digging into what the potential is for this Kelp Recovery Network in the very near future. So the overview is that there are over 100 individuals that are involved, including research institutions, nonprofits, industry, tribal representatives, fishermen, coastal community members, and even artists, managers, and other stakeholders. So it is a very diverse group, which is amazing. And we do have very active participation, which is awesome. And then the focus is really it started out as the North Coast, but we do have contributing participants from throughout California and the Puget Sound. So it has been growing. So whereas it really started as a community-based project on the North Coast, has now expanded quite extensively spatially, which I think is really amazing that we're now really more connected with other regions, including Central and Southern California, and then even as far away as the Puget Sound. So we do meet once a month. And now that we have been working on, sort of ways to align communication and really identify how to connect the Kelp Recovery Network a little more closely with our Kelp Recovery program, we're hopefully going to be expanding some of these outreach and communication efforts. So if anyone is interested in joining this network, you can email me and I will add you to our list. And it's a very light commitment of once a month on a third Thursday to meet and to share information and connect with other folks. And this is just a sort of a visual representation of that network. So I said it is very diverse in terms of what different areas people are engaged in. And this is outdated. There's definitely quite a few folks that have joined recently that I have not added to this infographic. So I'd love to revisit this and build it out a bit more. But this is just giving a general idea of the extent of this network and the different folks that are involved. So it's a very complicated infographic, but it's just to show the different areas that folks are interested in the network. Okay. Awesome. So what's next? First and foremost, we want to initiate restoration in the sanctuary. We're there. We know what we want to do. We know where. We are doing this restoration site assessment that's going to help that effort. But really, we're seeking funding to do that. And so I mentioned there are some promising opportunities in the near future, but this really is our priority. It's been 7, 8 years since this massive decline of kelp forests. And we need to get to that next step. So this is pretty critical. So we want to focus our efforts on initiating restoration, but we also want to circle back on these other projects that I've mentioned, including supporting the implementation of the mapping and monitoring recommendations that we're putting together in the near future, and coordinating across the region. Support and develop research and kelp monitoring efforts in the greater Farallones, and by extension, other sanctuaries as well. Enhance opportunities for outreach, education, and community-based science. So we are going to have a pretty big focus on this, I think, in the near future, which is exciting. And continue working towards the goal of healthy and resilient kelp forest habitat in the sanctuary. And we are a far ways away from that currently. But we're hoping that these steps that we're taking really lead to this actual goal, or for this goal to be actualized in the near future. Okay, so I have talked quite a lot, but I would love to see if folks have questions about any one of the projects that we're working on, or anything that I've mentioned about kelp loss on the North Coast or sanctuaries. You can feel free to jump in and let me know.